Hi everybody and welcome back to another video and yet another James Bond video. So in this one I'm going to be ranking all 6 of Sean Connery's James Bond films from worst to best. Yes, technically there's 7 because there was the other one in the 1980s called Never Say Never Again, but technically it's not an official James Bond film because it's a non-EON film, so technically I'm not including that one in this list. So the 6 films that Sean Connery did are Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, and Diamonds Are Forever. Now you may have seen from my video that I did about the James Bond actors, ranking them from worst to best, that Sean Connery is, in my opinion, the greatest ever James Bond actor. And in this one, I'm just going to be talking through the films that he was in and what makes them memorable and, you know, ranking them from the worst one to what I think is the best one. Now in number 6 I've gone with Diamonds Are Forever, and it's quite a simple reason as to why. Because I just don't think Sean Connery should have done it. It's that simple. He left the role after You Only Live Twice. George Lazenby took over in 1969 and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But yet Sean Connery only returned to play James Bond just because he wanted a bigger fee. That's literally the only reason why. I think you understood that his time was up, and you just knew that it wasn't the same James Bond that we saw from the 60s. I think times just generally changed because, particularly in the late 60s and the early 70s, Hollywood was changing drastically, and I just think Sean Connery's portrayal in Diamonds Are Forever was a little bit outdated. They needed something fresh and something a bit different if they were to continue with the James Bond character. I think what I struggled with Diamonds Are Forever was that, yes, the song is so iconic and so memorable, the storyline itself just didn't click. It just didn't feel like it was exciting. It was just a bit wacky, a bit silly. And yes, you may argue that all James Bond films are, but I just don't think it just had the drive to be entertaining or engaging in comparison to the other Sean Connery films that we've had. That's what was just disappointing about it, but ultimately that's just why Sean Connery probably shouldn't have taken the role and someone else should have taken it. But anyway, enough about that. Number 5. Right, number 5 I've gone with You Only Live Twice because it was the first time that we saw a James Bond film that did have a lot of elements of science and technology involved within the storyline, which was of course the scheme led by Blofeld, who has appeared on and off screen in other films that we saw with Sean Connery. And yes, we still had the traditional vehicles and the gadgets from Q given to James Bond in the film, but I think where this kind of resonates with the time that it was made was that the film did involve a war between the Soviets and the Americans, and of course it was at the height of the Cold War during the 60s as well, so it kind of was a close parallel between what was going on in the world and what was happening in the film. That's what I think really kind of was a crucial piece of giving us a sense of reality, I suppose, in a James Bond film, while also fictionalising it all and, you know, exaggerating the odd little bit. That's what I thought anyway, and of course it was the first time that we really saw Blofeld in the flesh, and I can't take the character all that seriously all that much now because of Dr. Evil in the Austin Powers films. He really kind of knew what buttons to press with James Bond, and that's why he appeared so often in the films. It's a bit like Joker with Batman. But in terms of the film itself, the pacing was a little bit off in the first act, but in the second act it was very, very good, and it got a lot more intense and you got to know the characters a lot more, and it was a decent Sean Connery Bond film, and I do enjoy watching it every now and again. So moving on to number 4. Right, number 4 I've gone with Thunderball because it was probably the first time that we saw a James Bond film as this huge extravaganza, almost like blockbuster, because the budget was significantly higher in this one in comparison to the 3 previous Bond films that we had. And, you know, a lot of that was down to giving us a lot more intensity in the action and a lot more drama and just something a bit different rather than just gun fights in the streets and, you know, gunfights between the cars and chases and whatnot. A large emphasis on this film is exotic because it's set on the beach a lot, and, you know, a lot of sequences are underwater. In fact, a quarter of the film is underwater, especially the final action sequence, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. In fact, it's one of my favourite action sequences, and which still remains now as a groundbreaking action sequence, because how many films do you get from the mid-60s that were able to pull off something like that? Nowadays it would be really easy, but back then it was like, oh my god, you'd never seen anything like it before. And I think that's what this film particularly focused on more than anything, rather than giving us another deep story and introducing us to a whole lot more characters. Yes, we still had new characters, but I think its particular focus was on the action sequences and the budget that it was on, and and all those things, technical attributes. So yes, Thunderball is another great Sean Connery film. So number 3. Right, number 3, I've gone with the first ever James Bond film, which of course is Dr. No. The fact that it was made in the early 60s with a £1 million budget, which at the time is a ridiculous amount of money, but now it's almost nothing really in the film industry. But because of that, it really transcended how we perceive action films. Even after 50 odd years, it's still as iconic and as memorable as it was back then. I mean, I'm going to glorify it in the sense that it's still so iconic because of the moment when he's sitting at the table when he says Bond, James Bond for the first time, and of course the famous moment when Ursula emerges from the sea in a bikini. That in itself is just one of the most iconic and legendary moments in film history. And Dr. No is that film that really transcended action films forever. I know we still had other James Bond films afterwards and all of that. It really kind of changed how we watch action. That isn't just about blowing things up. It's not just about chasing after people. It's about creating character and substance as to why they do that, and that's what you really understood with Dr. No and in other James Bond films as well. You can't not fault Dr. No as an iconic film, and also the character of Dr. No as well, that he was just such a legendary and iconic Bond villain, and he probably is one of the best ever. Dr. No was just way ahead of its time, and it really did revolutionise the action genre and how we watch them now. So moving on to number 2. Right, number 2, I've gone with From Russia with Love, and why I would choose this one above the very first James Bond film is that, yes, that one had action sequences. This one, for me, really kind of showed us a bit more depth to the characters and the narrative, particularly in terms of suspense, particularly the famous train sequence in which he is on a mission with a girl and then he's assaulted and he has to try and beat an adversary. You really understood that intensity within a confined situation, and I feel that particular moment really typified that, because in this one you follow him more as a spy than you do an action hero. You follow his adventures, you follow his journeys, and you also establish his relationships a whole lot more in this one in comparison to the previous film. And like Dr. No, From Russia with Love does follow a very traditional and simple storyline that is pretty much hero and love interest versus villain. They were addressed a whole lot more in the sense of emotion rather than just charisma or coolness. That being said, I've said 5 of the 6 James Bond film starring Sean Connery. What is my number 1 Sean Connery Bond film? Let's see. Now, I can probably say this for most people, particularly those who would have watched James Bond in the 60s and 70s growing up, but I think when you think of Sean Connery and James Bond, the film you think about is Goldfinger, because it really showed every single thing about what makes James Bond as brilliant and as exciting, as intense, as dramatic as it has been over the course of over half a century. And it just had everything. And interestingly, when Goldfinger came out, it had such a stronger reception than Dr. No and From Russia with Love did. And so many aspects in Goldfinger are among the most legendary because, just the villain Goldfinger, the quotes that he says, the particular line when he goes, "Do you expect me to talk, Goldfinger?" "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die." That line itself is just so memorable and quotable. Other characters like Oddjob, who's just a very unique character in himself, he throws a hat. And just from the way it was written and how it was filmed and how the characters were developed, and yes, there were some moments that really kind of were typical of James Bond, but ultimately the relationship between Bond and Goldfinger as hero versus villain still remains one of the best of all time. And not to mention the Bond girl, Pussy Galore. I really liked her relationship with Bond because she wasn't just this damsel in distress figure who would go along with Bond, but she really established herself as a female heroine, and that's what I think you need with a James Bond girl. And that has significantly changed over time, in which we have seen women as these more domineering figures in the James Bond films, but I think she was the first one to start it off. So for me, Goldfinger just had everything. It was fun, it was exciting, it was intense, it was dramatic, it was quotable, and you understood the characters a lot more, and it also transcended a lot of things in a number of different ways, not just the reception and box office performance, but also the way that people perceived women in the film as well. It just had all the necessities of James Bond at the time, and it just had a stronger emphasis on other things like narrative and characters and pacing and action as well. So that's why I would still say it's the ultimate Sean Connery Bond film for me. What is your favourite Sean Connery Bond film? How would you rank them down from worst to best? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you did want to enjoy this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and have a notification bell tick so you're notified when I upload a new video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care everybody.